the UN.
The United Nations was established with the purpose of creating a world community, living and working peacefully together. However, after 60 years, this idealistic goal has yet to be reached. The United Nations officially came into existence on October 24, 1945, founded upon the basic principle of working towards peace and global development. Yet, throughout history, many controversies have arisen due to the UN not carrying out these principles. For example, the United Nations has fallen under criticism for adhering to United States ideology and not to that of the global community. One must ask, what creates the ineffectiveness that plagues the UN, and to what extent does the United States influence the United Nations in matters of human rights and democracy? The United Nations is unsuccessful because the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France, hold too much influential power in politics, funding, and military aid, resulting in only their best interests being taken into account. A vast majority of the decision and policy making of the United Nations in issues of human rights and democracy is based upon the priorities of the United States. This is primarily due to the political and economic power of the United States, as well as the dominant foreign policy objectives of the nation.
The main function and power of the Security Council is to maintain international peace and security in accordance with the principles and purposes of the United Nations. The Security Council has failed to do this because the permanent members focus on their own interests rather than those of their fellow countries. While other organizations within the UN are created to make recommendations to governments, the Council alone has the power to make decisions which member states are obligated to carry out.
The United Nations works to maintain peace worldwide. Since its creation in 1945, the UN's purpose has furthered the preservation of human rights and the introduction of democracy in developing states. This aim was exemplified by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights published on December 10, 1948, which outlined the fundamental rights all people are entitled to. The U.S. Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which also oversees the Human Rights and Democracy Fund, was founded in 1993 upon the principles outlined in the Universal Declaration. Under the supervision of the Bureau, the United States creates and releases its own assessments of the quality of human rights internationally, including religious freedom and democracy. Recently, under the Obama administration, the United States chose to join the United Nations Human Rights Council, which was founded in 2006. Thus, the U.S. has increased its presence and resultantly its control in the UN.
The Security Council's greatest authority in politics lies in their great power unanimity, which is better known as the veto power. Each council member gets 1 vote, and 9 of the 15 must be affirmative for an action to go through. The 5 can veto the admission of any number and have done so 59 times, which is 21% of all vetoes up to 1990. Russia is the greatest supporter of the veto and has used the most vetoes of the 5 permanent members. Russia does not have as much economic influence as the other members, yet maintains power with the use of the veto. The veto power has historically been a problem within the United Nations because the 5 permanent members are all developed countries who have different interests than those of developing countries.
Most UN missions are in accordance with U.S. priorities and are dependent upon the U.S. for successful operation because of the nation's key position as a permanent member of the Security Council. In the past, the U.S. has suspended funding of UN projects to influence UN decision-making. The U.S. uses its veto power to achieve many of the nation's political goals and to maintain a level of control over the operations of the UN.
The United Nations is funded by both the evaluation of how much each member nation owes and by private organizations. The 5 permanent members are all within the top 10 contributors of the UN. Voluntary contributions are growing, and the wealthiest countries are the nations with the means to make these donations, which results in the developed countries having even more leverage within the UN. The 5 permanent members are all among the top 15 largest contributors to the peacekeeping budget. The U.S., for example, contributes more than 22% of the regular UN budget, and no mission can operate without the United States' votes in the Security Council. This means that the U.S. directly determines a majority of the UN's assessed budget. It is believed that a connection exists between the Security Council's membership and aid payments. When a country becomes a member of the Security Council, their U.S. economic aid increases by 77%, and UN development aid increases by 42%. These countries are therefore more likely to make decisions with the United States' interest in mind.
The U.S. is the top provider of funds for the UN peacekeeping budget, supplying nearly 27%. For the U.S., it is financially efficient to execute missions through the UN. Susan Rice, the U.S. representative to the UN, explained this economic model.
If the U.S. was to act on its own, unilaterally, and deploy its own forces in many of these countries, for every dollar that the U.S. would spend, the UN can accomplish the mission for 12 cents.
In Kosovo, since 1999, the U.S. has provided over $1.2 billion in aid. Kosovo is prospectively a valuable trade partner for the U.S., and the U.S. has sent around $11 million worth in goods and services to Kosovo. Much of the UN effort in Kosovo is bolstered by American dollars, and continued involvement is encouraged by the U.S. because of the large investment America has made in Kosovo. The UN mission in South Sudan was based on an initiative that began with a U.S. proposal to bring democracy and an end to violence in the region. This mission now receives the fourth highest portion of the UN peacekeeping budget at 9.2%.
Along with political and economic influence, the United Nations has a great amount of military influence. The 5 permanent members of the UN are the most prominent members of the arms industry. Together, they are responsible for 80% of reported conventional arms trade. The result of these countries being so involved in the arms business is that they are able to sell weapons to any nations, even those that may not have UN approval. Opposition groups may be provided with military aid by the Security Council members, and support is often given to undemocratic forces because of geopolitical goals of the global hegemony. The Security Council members are able to make decisions on which countries the UN may and may not help based on only their precedents.
The 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council hold too much power and are abusing this supremacy to make decisions based solely off of their interests. The Security Council was created so that the group of nations could make decisions for the entirety of the UN, but in reality, the decisions are most times only greatly benefiting the Security Council. The United States has become one of the most prominent countries in the United Nations, mainly due to the standing of the United States as a global hegemon. This supremacy gives the United States strong economic and political power that allows the nation to maintain a strong grip on the workings of the United Nations. Resultingly, the foreign policy priorities of the U.S. are present in many, if not all, UN missions. It is the responsibility of the United States and the Security Council to ensure that they use their power to create a more just and compassionate world.